Thank you so much for the introduction. And as kind of a precursor to the topic, I'm going to agree with Jan that 15 minutes is not enough to introduce the optional protocol, which is why I really hope that you will read the book, where I devote a very lengthy chapter to the protocol, to its doctrinal and textual analysis, and of course, different cases as well. And because 15 minutes is not enough to introduce the protocol, I'm not going to try to. Rather, I'm going to focus on the main focus of the protocol, and that is the children impacted by armed conflict. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Yes, I think I can. So let's get started. First of all, I wanted to say that it is truly an honor and a privilege to stand before you on this very significant occasion, the 3rd Children's Rights Day, as we reflect on the 35th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Today, we gather here to celebrate a landmark in international law, a milestone that enshrined in writing that should have always been self-evident, that children everywhere in the world are entitled to grow up in safety, dignity, and peace. Yeah, as we celebrate this very significant milestone, we must also confront the somber truth that this milestone, while historic and significant, it remains in many ways an unfulfilled promise. For all our declarations, our convention and its protocols, there are still children for whom these protections only exist on paper. 35 years after the convention, we are still failing children in some of the most harrowing ways imaginable. And the failure is especially stark when we consider the plight of children in armed conflicts. They're not just collateral damage. In war zones, they are often targets of these war zones. And their innocence is weaponized, their vulnerabilities are exploited, and their futures are stolen by those who wage war. So today I want to speak about these children whose cries often go unheard amidst the conflict and the chaos of war. They are children for whom the joy of Advent, the warmth of the holiday season, and the promises of a brighter tomorrow are distant dreams, if not altogether forgotten. So as we prepare for Christmas, we are reminded of the universal themes of hope and joy and peace and renewal. But for millions of children, this season does not bring the anticipation of gifts, of family gatherings, or the gentle glow of a Christmas tree. Instead, it is marked by deafening sounds of gunfire, the cold isolation of refugee camps, or the haunting memories of battlefields that and the battles that are often fought too close to home. While some children are counting down the days to Christmas, others are counting the days since they last saw their parents, their siblings, or their homes. And while some are surrounded by love and peace, others are surrounded by violence, stripped of the very protections that we promised them 35 years ago. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, adopted in 1989, was a watershed moment in the history of human rights, because it was the first international treaty to recognize children not merely as passive recipients of care, but as rights holders, entitled to protection, education, and a voice. And it became the most widely ratified treaty in history, which is a testament to its universal relevance and the global commitment to safeguarding children's rights. And yet, for all of its success, the convention alone was not enough to shield children from every threat. Recognizing this, the international community sought to build on its foundation, and that's why in 2000, the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflicts was adopted, a very crucial step toward addressing one of the gravest violations of children's rights. It is aimed to protect children from being recruited, exploited, and used in armed hostilities. It sought to reinforce the principle that children are not soldiers, that their place is in the classrooms and in playgrounds and not in the battlefields. But as we reflect on the protocol's promises 35 years later and its intentions, we must ask ourselves, have we done enough? are we truly living up to the ideals that we enshrined in the UNCRC 35 years ago? And I think that numbers often fail to convey the depth of human suffering, but they are necessary to understand the scale of the crisis. So today, an estimated 450 million children live in conflict zones, which means 1 in 6 children worldwide. These numbers are not abstract. They represent real lives. Children who, instead of growing up surrounded by family and friends, grow up amidst the horrors of war. And among these children, thousands are forced into roles that no child should ever endure. Conservative estimates suggest that 300,000 children are actively engaged and involved as child soldiers globally, recruited and exploited by both state and non-state armed groups. And these children are handed weapons heavier than their fragile frames, tasked with carrying out violence that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. And the reality is often much more insidious when we consider that many of these children are not recruited to fight, but to serve as spies, or messengers, or cooks, or porters. And some are subjected to sexual exploitation, with girls often being forced into marriages with commanders or used as bargaining tools. And these roles might be classified as indirect participation in hostilities under international law, but the trauma and the risks that they face are no less harrowing. The numbers alone, however, do not capture the human cost of these practices. What does it mean for a child to hold a gun for the first time, to be forced to pull a trigger, to witness and often commit atrocities not one, let alone a child, should ever see? For children in armed conflicts, these dangers go far beyond bullets and bombs. Many suffer severe malnutrition and lack access to basic health care, leaving them vulnerable to disease and long-term developmental challenges. Those who survive often bear physical scars, missing limbs, burn injuries, or untreated wounds, but the psychological scars are far harder to heal. Children are exposed to armed conflict frequently, experience post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety, and their nightmares are often filled with the horrors that they have witnessed: family members killed, villages burned, friends lost to violence. And these children are not just robbed of their childhoods, but also their futures. Their capacity to trust, to dream, and to belong is shattered. So armed conflict displays millions of children, forcing them to flee their homes and to seek refuge in overcrowded camps or in foreign lands. Today, children make up 41% of all forcibly displaced people worldwide. And refugee camps, while often safer than the active war zones, have their own dangers: exploitation, inadequate education, and poor living conditions. Many children spend their formative years without access to proper schooling, creating a lost generation of young people whose potential has been stifled by violence. Girls in war zones, I think, are also a unique challenge, because many of them are subjected to sexual violence as a deliberate tactic of war used to terrorize communities as a form of punishment. Girls are also disproportionately vulnerable to forced labor and trafficking, with many coerced into servitude or child marriages as a survival strategy. And their suffering is compounded by societal stigmas that isolate them further, even if they manage to escape the conflict. But behind every statistic, there's a story. A child who dreams of going to school, but instead has to carry a weapon. A girl whose only crime is being born into a war zone, and whose innocence is shattered by forces beyond her control. A boy who should be playing soccer, but instead is navigating landmines. So these children are not just victims, they are witnesses of the worst of humanity. They are reminders of our collective failure to uphold the commitments that we have made 35 years ago. The Convention on the Rights of the Child promised them protection, education, dignity. But for far too many, these promises remain unfulfilled. And as we reflect on the optional protocol and its intent to shield children from these horrors, we must remember that it is not enough to set legal standards. Enforcement is where the battle for these children's lives is won or lost. So every child recruited, exploited, or killed in armed conflict represents not just the failure of law, but the failure of humanity. Now, the optional protocol itself, adopted on the 25th of May 2000 and entering into force in February 2002, builds upon the foundational principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, recognizing the unique vulnerability of children in armed conflicts. It aims to provide stronger and more specific protections to prevent their recruitment, their exploitation, or participation in hostilities. At its core, the protocol embodies the principle that children do not belong on battlefields. The protocol establishes critical legal standards to protect children from the horrors of war. It prohibits the compulsory recruitment of anyone under the age of 18 years of age into state armed forces, and bans non-state armed forces from recruiting or using children under any circumstances. Additionally, it raises the minimum age of voluntary recruitment for at least 16 years with strict safeguards to ensure that such recruitment is truly voluntary, is informed, and is consensual. But the protocol does not stop at prevention. It also mandates states to take all feasible measures to demobilize children who have been recruited or used in hostilities and provide them with the necessary support and care, which means physical recovery, psychological rehabilitation, and social reintegration. It emphasizes the need for education, for healthcare, and vocational training to help children rebuild their lives after the trauma of war. Now, the protocol represents a significant step forward in international law. By setting 18 years of age as the minimum age for compulsory recruitment and direct participation in hostilities, it raises the standard for child protection. Moreover, it explicitly addresses the actions of non-state armed groups, which are responsible for much of the recruitment and exploitation of children globally. And this acknowledgement of the reality on the ground, where many conflicts are waged by non-state actors, is one of the protocol's most commendable strengths. The protocol also obligates state parties to report regularly to the Committee on the Rights of the Child on their efforts to implement its provisions. And this reporting mechanism ensures accountability and encourages states to continually evaluate and improve their child protection measures. Yet, as significant as the optional protocol is, it is not without its limitations. Its language, particularly the phrase, all feasible measures, leaves room for interpretation, particularly inconsistency in enforcement. And similarly, while the protocol prohibits the direct participation of children in hostilities, it does not ban their indirect participation, which is a loophole that allows children to continue being exploited in such roles as spies or porters or even in sexual servitude, all of which expose them to immense physical and psychological trauma. Furthermore, the protocol relies heavily on the political will of states to enforce its provisions. As of today, 172, I think, is on the presentation in the book, but actually as of today, it's already 173. States have ratified the protocol, but 17 countries have yet to sign or ratify it, and many others struggle with implementation. So the persistence of child soldiers in conflicts around the world is a stark reminder that ratification is only the first step, and meaningful action must follow. The optional protocol is more than merely a legal document. It is a call to action. It reminds us that protecting children in armed conflicts is not just a matter of law, but a matter of humanity. It challenges us to close the gaps in its implementation and strengthen and to hold all actors, state and non-state actors, accountable for violations. But most importantly, it calls us to remember who we are fighting for, the children whose futures hang in the balance. The protocol's ultimate goal is not merely to set standards, but to change lives, to ensure that no child is ever forced to carry the burden of war. And as we sit here today, children in nearly every corner of the globe continue to endure the unspeakable horrors of armed conflict. They are not just statistics, but faces, names, and voices, each representing a future stolen by violence. In Africa, decades-long conflicts have turned children into tools of war. In countries like South Sudan, in Mali, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, armed groups continue to recruit children despite international condemnation. In South Sudan alone has seen the recruitment of over 19,000 children since its civil war began in 2013. And these children are often kidnapped or coerced into fighting, losing not just their childhoods, but also their lives. Girls are particularly vulnerable and are frequently subjected to sexual violence and forced marriages within armed groups. In Somalia, the recruitment of child soldiers remains widespread, with Al-Shabaab forcibly enlisting boys and girls as young as 9. And reports indicate that these children are not only used as fighters, but also as human shields, making them targets in the brutal battlefield waged across the country. But we can also talk about other parts of the world. In Asia, in Myanmar, the crisis has generated a generation of children born into statelessness in conflict. In Afghanistan, where decades of war have ravaged the nation, children continue to be recruited both by the Taliban and other armed groups. But even in places just across the border from us in Europe, we see new conflicts emerge, and children, of course, being vulnerable in these conflicts. So, a call to action and a conclusion. The stories of these children demand more than just our sympathy. They demand action. And as we commemorate 35 years since the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we must ask ourselves, what kind of legacy do we want to leave behind? We must begin by closing the gaps in enforcement. Laws like the optional protocol are only as effective as the will to implement them. States must be held accountable, not just for ratifying treaties, but for taking concrete steps and to protect children on the ground. And this includes monitoring mechanisms, targeted sanctions against violators, financial and technical support for countries who are struggling with these standards. We must address the root causes of child recruitment. Poverty, lack of education, and systemic inequality are breeding grounds for exploitation. So investing in schools, community programs, and social safety nets is not just an act of charity, it's a strategy to prevent children from falling prey to armed groups. And of course, we must amplify the voices of survivors. Children who escaped the horrors of war carry invaluable insights into how we can improve protection mechanisms. Their resilience and their stories can inspire change and remind us of what is at stake. And let us not forget, of course, global solidarity. Each of us, whether a lawyer, a policymaker, an academic, all of us who are meeting here, simply an adult, a concerned citizen, we have a role to play. As we prepare to celebrate the joy and hope of the Advent season, let us commit to bringing that hope to every child, no matter where they live or what they have endured. Let us strive to create a world where no child is forced to wield a weapon, where every child can dream, and where promises we made 35 years ago are not just words on paper, but realities in their lives. Thank you.